do you think? And can you come up with some arguments justifying perhaps both these possibilities? The word is free.
Sorry, I missed.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
2 minutes I got disconnected, so I'm not sure I can
Okay.
add much.
We didn't hear you. That's good.
Any other one who wants to take a guess?
Well, I can't because I know the result.
Yeah, you know the answer, so you're forbidden.
Oh.
Okay, I can perhaps just go on. So
here, from in the chat, for men, woman may be like the shapes. Well, let's see here what it. Yeah, women may like the shapes. So perhaps women are more influenced.
Yeah, that's I will continue now. So that's exactly what we found when we did the study on university students, because we asked around 400 university students to sort of predict the outcome of this potential scenario. So these university students read a scenario saying that, well, imagine customers enter a store with an athletic-looking male employee present at the store entrance. How do you think this will influence either male or female customers in terms of their consumption inside the store? And well, virtually all the students thought that this was a very obvious answer to this question, because they more or less all replied that this, of course, should have a much more positive impact on female customers. So at least according to the university students, they thought that the presence of one of these athletic-looking men at the entrance of a retail store should increase spending in female customers, but not necessarily have any positive effect in male customers.
Could I just interrupt there, Tobias?
Yes.
Very good. I see that someone using the chat function. Perfect. I will check the chat function and I will tell your comments to Tobias if you have any problems with the microphones. Good. Please continue.
Super. Yeah. So I was a little bit skeptical about this prediction, primarily because there has been previous research showing, for instance, that men who show signs of something called physical dominance, which can be, for instance, men who display an athletic appearance, men who have upper body musculature, or men who are taller than average, for instance. These men, on average, they tend to be evaluated as being higher in status. And not only that, according to research, these men are also more successful on the mating market. They tend to have more reproductive success in the sense that on average they get a larger number of children compared to other less physically dominant men. They tend to earn more money. They tend to be more successful on the labor market. They tend to have a larger number of sex partners, and they tend to have more physically attractive girlfriends, presuming they're heterosexual. So rather than what the university students had predicted in this particular case, what I assumed was that the presence of a quite muscular male employee at the entrance of a store could activate some kind of threat to male customers' status. And because not all men can compete with a strong physique, one alternative way to signal status is, of course, to use the wallet instead. So in one study, I tested this prediction in an actual field experiment at, well, let's say a globally known household and furniture retailer. So at certain times and certain days, we had an athletic-looking male employee present at the store entrance, and at other days and times in a control condition, no employee was present at the store entrance. And then we compared consumer spending as a function of whether this muscular male employee had been present or absent at the store entrance, to see if his presence could actually have an impact on customers' purchase behavior. And this is what we found. So quite interestingly, we found that when this guy was present at the store entrance, male customers spent more than twice as much money inside this furniture store compared to females. But in the control condition, on the other hand, no difference whatsoever was found between men and women. So at least this provided some initial evidence for this so-called Abercrombie Fitch effect. And another interesting part of this field experiment was the fact that the effect wasn't driven by men merely purchasing a larger number of products inside the store that particular day when they were briefly greeted at the store entrance by this physically dominant male employee. But rather, the effect was driven by male customers purchasing much more expensive products, because we also analyzed the average price paid per individual product across these different conditions. And then we found that when this guy was present at the store entrance, male customers purchased products that were almost twice as expensive as those purchased by female customers. And this, of course, is, at least in some ways, supporting the argument that this effect was driven by some kind of stronger urge to communicate status by means of consumption, because expensive products, they tend to signal status to a higher extent than less expensive products. But as all field studies, this field study also had a couple of limitations. And the most crucial limitation, of course, was that we didn't manipulate the physical appearance of the person being present or absent at the store entrance. So it could be, of course, that this effect would merely be due to the fact that, well, any store employee present at the store entrance could increase spending among male customers, but not necessarily female customers. So to exclude that alternative explanation, I conducted a set of lab-based studies to provide more converging evidence for this effect. In one of these studies, I randomly assigned participants into two different conditions, both males and females. So one group of participants, males and females, they were exposed to a picture featuring a quite muscular male model. We can call him Arnold. Whereas the other group of participants instead were exposed to a substantially less physically dominant male, Arnold during an ongoing hunger strike or something like that. And then participants rated what they thought about these men that they were exposed to on a set of items that were in reality unrelated to the actual study. And when this was done, they were presented with a couple of different products from two distinct product categories. So some of these products, they were highly associated with status. You could think of products such as an exclusive watch or a pair of designer sunglasses or something like that. The other set of products, they were substantially less linked to status. Products such as a washing machine or basic toiletries, for instance. And now the prediction for this specific study was that when men were exposed to the muscular male model, they should report a stronger willingness to consume the status signaling products, but not necessarily the more functional products, because they do not signal status to the same extent. And again, similar to the field study, we did not predict that this effect would occur in female participants. And this is exactly what we found. So when men were exposed to the physically dominant man, they were much more willing to spend the expensive high-status products, but not the functional products. Whereas for women, type of exposure didn't influence their consumption preferences either towards status signaling goods or more functional items. So this provided additional evidence for this effect. But in an attempt to try to generalize this effect further, I conducted 2 additional studies. In one of these studies, here is a graphical representation of the results I just explained. In one of the subsequent studies, I wanted to find out whether this effect would occur when status signaling is conceptualized and measured through size rather than price, because some people say that size matters. So what I did in this study instead was to ask people about their logo size preferences on clothing. And again, I used a similar procedure as in the former study that I explained. So some men and women were exposed to a quite muscular male employee, whereas other males and females were instead exposed to a much less muscular male employee. And then, consistent with the previous study, they rated what they thought about these men on a set of unrelated items, after which they indicated how large and conspicuous and visible brand logos they preferred on their clothes. And again, I found support for my theorizing in the sense that in the non-dominant condition, there wasn't any type of gender differences in terms of logo size preferences, but for men instead, men who were exposed to this other physically dominant men, they were much more inclined to prefer large, conspicuous brand logos on their clothes. In a final study, I wanted to investigate whether this effect could be replicated when I used a behavioral dependent variable instead. Rather than asking people about their logo size preferences, I instead relied on their actual drawings of brand logos on a piece of clothing. So again, the procedure was quite similar to the previous studies. Some participants were exposed to a muscular male advertising model, whereas other participants were exposed to his subtly smaller twin brother. And they rated these guys on a set of unrelated items. They were exposed to a blank t-shirt. And then they were asked to draw a logo on the shirt in a size they would prefer if they would buy this shirt for themselves. Because I predicted that, consistent with the previous study, those men who were exposed to the muscular male advertising model, they should draw larger logos on their clothes. For women, type of exposure didn't influence logo size drawings, but again, consistent with the previous results, men exposed to the muscular male model, they drew substantially larger brand logos on their clothes. And even more interesting in this study was the fact that this effect was particularly powerful among one special type of men. So consistent with the so-called Napoleon complex, which postulates that short men are sometimes even more to compensate for their seemingly lacking stature and status. It was men who were shorter than average who drew the largest brand logos on their own clothes. So this is an example where you can sort of apply the authority principle in a consumption setting, you could say. In another study, another project of my doctoral research, rather than using the authority principle, I wanted to compare two other principles of social influence to each other and see which one of these principles that were most powerful in predicting consumers' purchase behavior. And again, the study was conducted at this global household and furniture retailer. And now you can even see where this study was conducted. So the procedure of this study was something like this. When customers entered IKEA, a couple of research assistants approached them and asked if they were willing to participate in a study dealing with their overall shopping experience inside IKEA that particular day. And those who agreed, they received this map, as you can see on the picture. And as you may notice, this map has a couple of numbers indicated. At the second station, at number 2, I was standing because I acted a store employee in this experiment. So what I did at the second station was that I gave customers who came to me a product demonstration of some wardrobe system inside IKEA. But I did this demonstration in 2 very distinct ways. So for some customers, I gave the demonstration while constantly encouraging customers to touch the products that I displayed. Whereas for the other group of customers, I did the same product demonstration in the same order of items, but instead of encouraging customers to touch the products, I forbidden them to touch the products. So I said something like, these products are for display only, so please, you cannot touch the items. You're not allowed to do that. And then the purpose of this experimental manipulation was to find out whether the type of product demonstration could impact customers' subsequent purchase behavior inside IKEA that particular day. And in so doing, compare 2 distinct principles of social influence. So if you believe in the commitment and consistency principle, it may be that customers who are encouraged to touch products early on in the store may be more inclined to continue with this behavior throughout the entire store in the name of consistency. And they may therefore be more inclined to actually put a larger number of products in their shopping carts. So that was the sort of consistency-based presumed effect that could occur based on customers being encouraged to touch products early on inside IKEA. But there is also this alternative of the scarcity principle, and specifically something that is called psychological reactance, which means that when your freedom to act or behave in a certain way is restricted, you will feel the need to regain this sense of freedom. And that may mean that you are even more inclined to display the forbidden behaviors later on to regain your own sense of freedom and show to yourself and others that you sort of decide your own destiny, so to speak. So according to this scarcity-based explanation, instead, what could happen was that those customers being forbidden to touch the products early on at IKEA at this product demonstration, they should feel a stronger urge to subsequently regain their sense of freedom to touch and hence put a larger number of products in their shopping carts and end up spending more money. So here's the second question. Which one of these explanations do you believe in explaining the results that actually occurred?
Yeah, no response yet, no comment. You can unmute your microphone if you want to speak out, or you can write in the messages.
All right. What was the question again?
The question is whether you think that customers who were either encouraged to touch the products at the product demonstration would end up spending more money inside IKEA that particular day, or whether you think that the other alternative of those customers being forbidden to touch the products would be more inclined to spend more money.
Reply from Jörgen here, he thinks that the forbidden group spend more money.
Yeah, I would think so too.
Yeah,
I would scarcity. All right, and I would think, I would think so too. Forbidden. The more, yeah.
So you are leaning towards this old saying that the forbidden fruit is the sweetest.
Michael thinks the reverse here, that those that touch the product will buy more.
Yeah, because according to the existing theorizing, when I conducted the study, it wasn't a very obvious response to this question. So both alternatives could apply. But what I did in this study that I actually used to do when I'm not entirely sure of how customers will behave in a real retail setting is, again, to ask students to predict the outcome and see if they are correct or not. And here are the predictions made by the students that I asked. So according to the students, they were leaning towards this commitment and consistency explanation. So the students, they thought that being encouraged to touch products early on inside IKEA should result in a larger number of products being purchased and more money being spent inside IKEA compared to if customers are instead forbidden to touch the products at the product demonstration. But again, it appeared as if the students' predictions were not entirely correct this time either, because in reality, the opposite applied. So those customers being restricted to touch the products early on inside IKEA, they felt probably this urge to compensate for their lack of freedom. So this meant that they ended up spending more than double the sum of money inside IKEA that particular day. And they also purchased a significantly larger number of products. But interestingly, from a retailer's point of view, this strategy of forbidding customers to display certain behavioral patterns may not be positive in the long run, at least, because what I also measured in this study was customers' post-purchase satisfaction, how satisfied they felt with their purchases at IKEA this day. And then it turned out that those customers in the touch restriction condition, so to speak, they were significantly less satisfied, not only with their purchases, but also with their stay at IKEA that day. So in the long run, of course, this may mean that these customers, even though they spent much more money at this very moment, they may be less likely to actually return to IKEA and be loyal towards the brand. So that's important to keep in mind.
We have a question here from Michael.
Yes.
About the ones that touched the products. What if it would have been a different store, say on the upper scale of products?
Yeah, that's actually a very nice comment. I almost got allowance to do this study in a Swarovski store also, but for some reasons it didn't happen. But it would be very interesting to see if the sort of consumption setting could make a difference here, because I could imagine that in certain types of stores, it's perhaps more important to touch products than in other store settings. And at IKEA, for instance, you almost take for granted that, it's your right as a customer to touch the products inside IKEA. It's very strange when you are not allowed to do that any longer. But that's not necessarily the case in other store settings. So, but I don't have a very straightforward answer what will happen in more like high-end stores, but it would definitely be interesting to investigate that as well. Any other questions? If not, then it's time to continue to the last project. And this project relates at least implicitly to the liking principle. And what I did in this project was to investigate whether prior exposure to either attractive or less attractive faces could influence people's subsequent food choices. As you probably know very well, faces in general and attractive faces in particular are used extremely frequently in marketing, advertising, and packaging design, not least given their ability to attract attention better than almost any other stimuli. Research shows, for instance, that we as adults, we only need 13 milliseconds to evaluate how attractive another person is. And even newborn infants younger than 1 day from birth prefer to look at attractive faces. And they look longer at such faces when presented with pairs of attractive and less attractive faces, thus challenging the assumption that perceptions of attractiveness are socially constructed, media-induced, or learned through cultural standards, and that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Meta-analytic reviews and cross-cultural research further reveal that people show a very high agreement in determining whose face is and is not attractive, both within and across cultures and independent of gender and age. But despite these quite fascinating findings, little is known about the effects that attractive faces have on people's choice behavior in various consumption settings. So that was sort of the reason why I wanted to focus on whether attractive versus less attractive faces could influence people's subsequent food choices. In this project, rather than asking students, I asked a quite large number of marketing professors who should be, you could think, quite knowledgeable in this topic. So I gave them two simple questions, or one actually. How do you think most people will be influenced by viewing an opposite sex individual with an attractive or an unattractive face just before making a food choice? And then I had a binary response format. So the marketing professors could either choose that most people would be more inclined to choose a healthy food option or an unhealthy food option in each of these two cases. And here are the predictions made by the marketing professors. So as you can see, there was a highly so-called statistically significant difference depending on whether the individual was more or less attractive. And the marketing professors predicted that people in general should be much more inclined to choose a healthy food option when they had previously been exposed to an opposite sex individual with an attractive face. So this was the prediction made by marketing professors. And now I won't ask you about the prediction, but I will go directly to the results of at least one of the studies that I conducted after this initial intuition study had been conducted with the marketing professors. So in this study, I had both male and female customers participating, and they were, depending on which condition they were assigned to, exposed either to an attractive face of the opposite gender or a less attractive face of the opposite gender. And then they rated the face on a set of validated attractiveness items so that I could be perfectly sure that these faces actually differed in terms of physical attractiveness. Even though these faces have been used in previous research, I did it to be perfectly sure that they differed in attractiveness, which they did. Subsequently, when participants had rated these faces, they were, as some kind of a gift for their participation in the study, offered to choose between 4 different food products, either an apple, a chocolate, a banana, or a small bag of potato chips. And now the question was, unbeknownst to participants, of course, whether they would be more or less inclined to choose the unhealthy food options when they were exposed to the attractive phases. And contrary to the marketing professor's predictions, I did find that when people in general and men in particular were exposed to the attractive phase of an opposite sex member, they were much more inclined to end up actually choosing an unhealthy food option. And what could be the explanation for this strange behavior, one could ask? Well, according to some theories, when people are exposed to hot stimuli, that is stimuli that you can associate, for instance, with sex or some other pleasurable activities, then we as humans, we tend to lose a certain degree of our self-control. And as a consequence of this, we want more instant gratification. And because unhealthy food products such as chocolate, for instance, typically evokes a more direct reward response in our brains, that could be at least part of the reasons as for why people ended up choosing more unhealthy foods when they were exposed to an attractive member of the opposite sex. I did the same experiment when participants instead were exposed to either attractive or less attractive individuals of the same sex as themselves, and then nothing really happened. So this provides some support for the claim that these effects are due to some kind of hot state that's activated when they are viewing these, well, potentially a little bit arousing pictures. In one of the other studies that I've conducted, I actually found that the psychological process justifying these effects is that when people are exposed to these more physically attractive opposite sex individuals, they become slightly more aroused, and their higher levels of arousal in turn makes them more likely to choose unhealthy foods. So these are three of the examples from my dissertation research, and I hope that they have shown at least some applications of social influence in various consumption settings. So to end this presentation, I have a few take-away messages that I want you to have with you after today's presentation. And one of the
Can I stop you there? And I'm just the last example. All right.
Yes.
You said because when you started your last part, and you said unhealthy food and healthy food.
Yes.
Attractive and unattractive opposite sex. And before I saw the picture, and before I was imagining actually salad or pizza. All right.
Okay.
And so just a comment. And I was not imagining an apple and a chocolate and then chocolate cakes.
Yes.
And I have to say, even after looking at your study, and I would still actually, looking at the top right face, I would, even knowingly, I would go for chocolate for some reason. And because and I'm wondering what would happen if you would replace chocolate and apple with salad and or food.
Yeah.
Healthy and in literal terms unhealthy food, because in this case this is not food.
No, that's a very good question, and sometimes when you do research, especially when you do research in lab settings, you have to be a little bit pragmatic in the sense that you cannot serve hot food dishes to participants. It's both more time consuming, and it's difficult to get it equal for each participants, and therefore you sometimes rely on quite simple stimuli, such as in this case chocolate versus apple, as some
I suppose my question is, what do you think the participants would have answered when you would have served literally healthy or unhealthy food? do you think that the results would be the same or not?
Well, at least in the third experiment I conducted in this particular project, I exposed participants to a wider variety of different food options, not only these simple alternatives as apple and chocolate, but also I think I had the like hamburger versus salad, as you said. Even in that case, I obtained the same result. But of course, asking people in a survey what they would choose doesn't necessarily mean that they will display this behavior in a real consumption setting, because all these experiments were conducted in quite controlled lab settings and not in a restaurant or something like that. So I'm not entirely sure whether these quite clear effects that I've obtained in the lab would be that easily replicable if you do the study in more naturalistic settings, such as in a restaurant, for instance. But I would presume that at least to some extent you could presume similar effects. But that also taps to another interesting part, because in this study, all individuals made their choices individually. But I could imagine that if you are eating together with some other people in a restaurant, then there may be something called self-presentation concerns, which means basically that you want to convey a good impression about yourself. And for that reason, it may be that, at least for females, they could end up being more likely to choose healthy food alternatives when they are served by an attractive male waiter, for instance, because they want to convey a good impression towards this person. But when you do a study in isolated lab settings, there's, well, at least to some extent, quite artificial, and therefore the results that you obtain in lab settings are not necessarily the same as those that you will obtain if you do the same study in more real-life settings. So I guess some other researcher will have to conduct that study in more naturalistic settings to see if these results would apply there as well, or if they may be even reversed.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. But that's a very good question. So my takeaway message based on this presentation is, first of all, that you shouldn't always trust either your own intuition or other people's intuition, because obviously what seems to be very clear in hindsight isn't necessarily that clear in foresight. People often think that when they hear about the scientific study that they say something like, oh, this is obviously obvious. Why did these stupid researchers conducted this study in the first place? It's so obvious, these results. But again, what seems to be obvious in hindsight isn't always that obvious before you actually conduct your study. And another thing that I hope that I've been able to demonstrate with this presentation is that people are extremely easily influenced by various factors in their surrounding environments. And consumers is, of course, no exception to this rule. Yet another thing that was the sort of core theme of my doctoral dissertation is that threats to certain important aspects to a customer's self-view or identity can create compensatory responses, which in consumption settings typically means compensatory consumption. So in the first study, a threat to male customer status made them more likely to compensate by purchasing status signaling products. In the second study, a threat to customers' freedom to touch created a compensatory effort to touch more products, which in turn resulted in significantly more money being spent in a store. And in the third study, a threat to customers' self-control in one domain created a compensatory type of behavior in another unrelated domain. So when people tended to lose their self-control in something that you could relate to the sexual domain. They wanted more instant gratification in the food domain. And yeah, again, these results, I believe, should be not only interesting for marketers or advertisers or retail managers, but also for us as ordinary customers, because when we are informed about these results, we, at least in theory, could be better able to resist various influence attempts in the future.
And Michael, you had a question there.
Question, please. On the third statement here, that consumer threats can create compensatory consumption. Do you think that is a defensive behavior or an aggressive behavior?
Oh, that's a good question. I do think, especially given the fact that people in general seem to be quite bad in predicting both how they would behave in these situations themselves and how other individuals would behave, that these effects are acting at a subconscious level. So I don't think that people deliberately decide to, for instance, purchasing a high status product just because they are viewing this other muscular man close to them. So I do think that these effects, they act at a subconscious level. But in terms of your question, I'm not entirely sure, actually. I think I have to think about that more carefully. I don't dare to come up with an answer, but it's a very interesting question.
Good. Then you have another study to do, Tobias.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Or comment?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll throw last one. If you have to choose as the researcher, your favorite tool for influence, I'm thinking Cialdini, because that's all I'm into now. Which one would you choose? Weapon of influence, all right? You pick one, your favorite, based on your research and based on your...
Do you mean which influence principle? Or?
Yeah, exactly. Just try to... what's your most favorite so far?
Yeah, that's also an interesting question.
I mean, of course, your opinion, your I suppose, answer is based on your experiences and your...
Yes, of course.
Your good and bad.
Yeah. Well, since quite much of my research focuses on how various nonverbal cues can influence consumer behavior, I would probably go for either the authority principle or liking and sympathy, because, as you know, one of the aspects of the liking principle is physical attractiveness, for instance, and it has been shown in multiple studies that whether we like it or not, people are quite superficial and they cannot really distance themselves from this what is beautiful is good stereotype. So in terms of doing research, I find it very fascinating to examine the potential effects that attractive individuals or other attractive aspects can have on consumers. So maybe that would be my favorite then.
Authority, yeah. I like that too. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I think I'm done, actually. So in case you have some additional comments or things that you want to convey, Lars, then the word is yours.
I think you have wrapped it up yourself, summarized your presentation very good. And for those of you listening, you can always come back, post questions through your blog posts or through Twitter, and we can use that as another channel to further discuss these aspects. So please take the message home and consider it, whether it's relevant for your situation and your business, your organization. And some of it might be valuable addition to the readings that you have done. And I just want to thank you, Tobias, for taking the time to participate.
Yeah, thank you.
And interesting to get these new lines of thoughts. So we thank you for that. Next week, we will run another webinar. And at that, I will be accompanied by another colleague here from CTF. You have seen her on the videos, some of the videos of the principles, and she will talk about her PhD that she did a couple of years ago here. So I will give some more info through Twitter about the content and highlight it so you will not forget. The same time and the same place next week. So thank you all for participating today.
Have a good weekend.
Yes, the same to you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And as a wrap up, I'll just, because I think that the recordings started a minute in the session, and you have just seen Tobias Otterbring from Aarhus University presenting his research on compensatory consumption. So I hope that you have gained some insightful knowledge from this webinar. Bye-bye.